Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Jennifer. How are you?
Good. I'm here with Jeff Grant, who is the founder of Progressive Prison Ministries. We actually went to seminary together at Union Theological Seminary, and I always knew that Jeff would go off and do something quite amazing, and he has with Progressive Prison Ministries. And Jeff, I'd really just like to hear, what is your ministry about, and what issue does it address?
Well, thank you. My wife, Lynn Springer, and I founded the first ministry in the country that's created to support white-collar criminals and their families. And I know that seems a little bit unique, and it is. After I graduated from Union Seminary, my first job was in the inner city in Bridgeport, where I became the associate pastor and director of prison ministries for the First Baptist Church. And I spent 2 years in the inner city, but at the same time, we were living in Greenwich, and we had been for the last 10 years, and I was going to recovery, and every person who came through recovery, who was heading to prison or coming back from prison, everyone said, "Go see Jeff, he's the prison guy." So what happened was that these two concepts kind of came together, that I was working with kind of the masters of the universe and hedge fund guys and financial guys in Greenwich who, unfortunately had issues and problems of incarceration issues, but getting a lot of, on the street experience in Bridgeport, where they have a much more embodied, experience of prison and criminal justice. And so it's really wonderful to bring some of those lessons from the inner city to people who aren't so used to it but need it badly.
And what kind of services does your ministry offer to both the men who are typically men, as I understand it, who are being incarcerated, as well as their families?
Well, I would say the big picture is that we help them get from wherever they are, say the point of entry where they call us up, anywhere from 2 years to a week before they're incarcerated. And we help get them all the way through the process to out the other side to a successful, life of faith and dignity and productivity after prison. There's nobody who's really out there who's doing that service for the white-collar community. For example, they're lawyers, and this, obviously all of them are working with lawyers, but the lawyers are mechanics. They're there for a specific purpose, and once the sentencing is done, they're over, and then all these guys and their families are kind of left on their own. So it's wonderful to take them kind of from a material way of life that they can't ever go back to, at least not the way they had it, to a spiritual way of life and embracing different values. And you'd be shocked at how many of them are really open to that message once they start the transformation process.
So how do they usually find you? How do people who are, either going through trial or about to be sentenced find out about your services?
Well, I would say that most of them are kind of trolling the internet looking for resources because they're frightened. And this is an experience they've never been through before. So they're looking in nooks and crannies and anything they can find on the internet. And at this point, we have a big presence, on the internet, mostly through our website and blog, prisonist.org. And also, we've been the subject of magazine articles and newspaper articles, and those are reprinted. And also our newsletter, which we not only post on the internet and send around through email, but it winds up in prison. Well, one, I send it to my guys who are in prison, but it winds up in the prisons, and in the prison network, it spreads pretty rapidly. So we get a lot of inquiry that way, and surprisingly, it surprised me anyway, that we get a very large percentage of initial inquiries from the families, because the guys are so scared. They're so locked up. They're in isolation. They haven't spoken to anybody about these issues. Their lawyers won't let them speak to anybody. but they can speak to us because as clergy, we have confidentiality. So that's a real distinguishing factor for who we are and what we can do in terms of breaking through those initial layers of fear and shame.
And recently, you had quite a breakthrough with one of your cases as far as helping a mother and her children who had basically had their assets frozen while her husband was in combination with her husband's assets, which had also been frozen. And you actually had quite a breakthrough with what you were able to do for her. Can you tell us a little about that story?
Yeah, I mean, at that point, I had only been working with men, the actual defendants, and my wife had worked with some of the families, but we got a call about this woman, and her husband was in prison, and it was the largest financial prosecution in the state in which it was prosecuted, and it was huge.
Wow.
And he had been locked up, and she was left with $150. And so by the time we spoke to her, she was on food stamps, and she needed Operation Fuel, state supplied fuel to heat her house, and she had this very large house, and they would only heat the house for 2 or 3 days a month because the house was so large. The allocation they gave her, and it was a very cold winter. Not this winter, the winter before, it was a very cold winter. So on the coldest days, she and her children would come stay with us because they really didn't have any other choice.
And they couldn't get a smaller apartment because she had no money to even to get an apartment, right?
All of her assets had been frozen, and she brought significant assets into the marriage. But when the government does these asset freezes, they don't discriminate really, or they don't dissect who's what. They just freeze everything. And she told us her story, and she had been to lawyers and accountants and all kinds of people to try to help her. But since she had no money to retain anybody, they wouldn't they wouldn't represent her. So she told us her story, and after telling us the story, it was obvious that she had nothing to do with the underlying crime, and that she was really in this tough spot. And so I told her I would take the case. And she was like stunned. She started to cry. And she looked at my wife and she said, basically she said, look, I can't afford to be messed with. I'm too emotionally fragile. And Lynn said to her, look, if Jeff says he'll take it, they'll take it. So she looked at me, the woman looked at me and she said to me, well, what are you going to do? I'm not a lawyer, although I used to be one. So I said, well, there's only two things that we really have to know. The first thing is that you're living in this huge house and the government wants it. And so long as you and your two minor children, she had children 6 and 8 at the time, and they said, so long as you and your children are in the house, they're going to have a difficult time in evicting you. And the second thing is that I'm going to have to go into Manhattan and find lawyers who are going to donate about $1 million of pro bono legal time.
Wow.
And so she said, how are you going to do that? I said, I have no idea. And I did. I made the rounds. And we got her, lawyers who were just terrific and smart and understanding and donated a lot of time. And I really appreciate their firms for supporting them. And at the end of about a year, we got her, for the first time in U.S. history, the return of her assets in an act of financial litigation and a considerable amount of money as well.
And people don't think of a ministry typically as being able to pull something like that off, which I think makes your ministry very unique. But also people don't tend to think about the effect on children and families when somebody goes to prison, particularly for these types of crimes, that it can really leave families very vulnerable. And, I noticed that you said that we need a spiritual solution to the process of reentry from prison. And I'm curious, what makes you say that? What makes you think there's a spiritual solution?
Well, first of all, almost everybody who goes through this goes through some form of spiritual transformation. And, whether they know it or not in the beginning when they first call, they don't really know what's ahead of them. But in truth, the real spirituality is in accepting what's real, what is. I think that's where, God intends us to be, and I think that's what's even called in spiritual or religious circles. I mean, we have to deal with the reality of what is right now, as opposed to mourning the past or being in fear of the future, and so this place that they're in, we learned a lot about it in seminary as, liminality and liminal places and things like that. It's hard to get people to live in this kind of radical acceptance, but once they do, everything kind of polarizes and it becomes much clearer that they can live this life of joy and abundance, and it doesn't have to be formed on money anymore. And so, that's really our definition of what the spiritual solution is. Not that people don't have to work and earn a living, but they don't have to treat money as their god.
And what are some of the issues that you see with reentry in our country? And what kind of ways do you support people in the reentry process?
Well, the larger issue of mass incarceration and reentry throughout the country, I'm really happy that it's now part of the national debate, that we can actually talk about it. Like you and I can even talk about it right now. But that wasn't really true 4 or 5 years ago. It was still kind of an under the rug subject, and people weren't really talking about a lot of issues that we're now comfortable talking about. Obviously it took unfortunately, it took like a new town to be able to talk about, for people to be able to address gun control. And so now mass incarceration with Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, and Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, and bringing out the issues that we really live in this kind of a prison industrial complex where they take advantage of people who are impoverished and of minority races and things like that to fund their whole complex, and that was eye-opening for me. White collar people are kind of have a double problem, and there's not a lot of empathy and compassion for them because people regard them as privileged,
right?
And in most cases that was probably true. But once these problems happen, they're not privileged anymore. They're brought to their knees. But these are primarily crimes of trust. Financial impropriety, crimes of trust. And so white collars find it very, very difficult to find jobs on the outside. All people who've been to prison, all felons have that issue. But here, where their highest best use of their repurposing their skill set is a very, very difficult thing when people won't trust you again.
And so they have to go through a process of trying to rebuild that trust, I guess, with both their family and their business networks.
Absolutely. I think that the biggest single problem is that their egos are so fragile that they're so been beat up by the process for so long that they don't go back to the basics. For example, if you're graduating college right now, you would know that you have to send out 200 resumes,
right,
and you get 10 interviews, and you get a job from one of them.
Right.
But these guys, what happens is that they can't handle rejection, and they're so fragile, they're so vulnerable, they can't handle rejection. So they hear 2 or 3 rejections, and they extrapolate that as a world that's not going to be open to them. Instead of doing exactly what you were doing to get out of college. Who do you know? Who do your friends know? And network the way you're supposed to network. So it's counseling through that with compassion compassion and kindness and dignity and respect, especially when, at a time of life where, there may not be open to those, to those suggestions is really part of what we do.
Is there legislation that you'd like to see around the reentry process across the board in our country?
Well, I would say that the biggest single thing that could change the face of it is that what everybody, when they come out of prison or they come out of jail, what they really need mostly is jobs. Mm-hmm. And there's other things they need too. They need, emotional support. They need soft skills. They need drug and alcohol counseling if that's in their history. There's other things. They need housing. There's other things, but jobs is the number one. Mm. So, it seems to me that subsidized employment opportunities where the government actually subsidizes employers for taking a chance on formerly incarcerated people would be a great project to have on the national level or on the state level, and I think it would come back in spades. I think it would come back in ways where that would be a much more productive workforce. It would create taxpayers, which is and it creates kind of a wholeness in the community that has really suffered because of all of this.
Mm. So it sounds like a major part of your theology includes second chances.
All of this, everything I'm doing now really came from what I learned at Union Seminary. Because what I really learned was like the depth of objectivity, and it's okay to be subjective, to stand up for what I believe in and not really worry about what everyone else is saying. And all of our classmates were, they were battling so many things and out there on the front lines and picketing and doing sit-ins and whatever they were doing. And I never knew that that's what ministers could do.
Right.
So this is really just an extension of that, in a way that's appropriate for our constituency.
And I'm curious, Jeff, how your personal spirituality or your personal spiritual practice informs this ministry that you've created and the work that you do.
That's a great question. Well, first of all, I would say that the spiritual center of my life is recovery. And so I learned a lot of it in recovery. And before I went to prison, because I don't know if we've mentioned that, in 2006 and 2007, I was in federal prison for a white-collar crime, and I served 14 months. But I went into prison almost 4 years sober. Mm. And so that's a big distinguishing factor between my trajectory and most other people who go to prison, because they go to prison addicted or they find drugs in prison. Mm. And sobriety is really, an important part of this. And what I've learned not only through recovery, but also learned in seminary was, the importance of balance, which I never really had in my life. Mm-hmm. So now when I pray or I meditate or I read spiritual writings or I engage with other people in these things, it's all about achieving this kind of this balance that allows me to be successful at this project and what I do, but not get so carried away with it that it becomes all I do. Mm. And that's not who I was before. I was a type A corporate real estate lawyer, take no prisoners, and ultimately I was the prisoner, wasn't I?
Well, it's really amazing to hear your story of taking your own personal experience and your own difficult times and then using that and transforming that into something redemptive that really helps other people and pulls other people up. So, Jeff, thank you so much for the work that you do, and thanks for talking about it today.
And thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for everything you do as well. I see you on the internet all the time, and that's really exciting for me.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff.